older, but like if we're talking about the day-to-day developers, people that you're going to be interacting with on an average, these were kids that were under 15 years old. Yeah, I started using Sugar Labs like when I was like 11 or 10, and I was even one of the oldest kids. There were people beyond
those aspects. The more people will get on board and deal with their fears and move towards that positive place of change. But it's not through rational arguments, I think. And this is again the problem with this value conversation. I mean, half the time, you know.
And this is kind of like one of the requirements. If you fail to do that like 3 years in a row, like they can remove you from the job. And when we started looking at what was on offer, there was nothing in regards to cybersecurity. So we actually...
Hello, my name is Ildiko.
And I'm Phil.
And this is the My Open Source Experience podcast, where we discuss all the things about the mechanics of open source in business and in communities. Follow the podcast on your favorite platform and check out season 2 episodes with Samson Goddy.
Open source is interesting.
Clare Dillon.
Great collaboration.
Wayne Starr.
Freedom.
Stephen Wally.
Good engineering.
Austin Bryan.
Community.
Tom Sadler.
Collaboration.
Federico Gonzalez Waite.
Limitless.
Amanda Brock.
The future.
Gregory Kurtzer.
Collaborative.
Michael Dexter.
Freedom.
And Kelsey Hightower.
Open source is your opportunity to change the world around you.
In this segment, Samson Goddy talks about why you should not give your kids tablets or smartphones, but rather give them access to an open source environment where they can learn about the technologies. Would you say, based on that experience, like if any kid ever stumbles on this podcast, to just encourage them to do and get their hands dirty and just go after what interests them and put in the effort and energy to figure it out?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm still one of those people that I don't think any kid would get motivated enough to build things if they're being handed like an iPad or a Chromebook or something. Except maybe you're telling them to build a web app or something. And I still have a strong opinion that I don't think web is cool enough. Desktop, I don't know. I just feel so. I mean, it's nice. I mean, it's the power of JavaScript over time is crazy. Don't get me wrong. Like, I love it. Like, the fact that you can do things on the web is great. But I don't know. I felt more like an engineer when I was, I don't know, doing desktop stuff. I don't know. That's just a feeling. But of course, that was like over 10 years ago. So I don't know. Yeah, a lot of things have changed.
That's cool. And to be honest, I don't know very much about Sugar Labs and that desktop. But from your description, it sounds very, very inviting, I guess would be the word I would use to go to a hacker. And so I'm surprised I haven't heard more of it. So that's interesting.
Yeah, it is intentionally designed for you to fix things. It's almost like, hey, this is a cool thing, but in order for you to do it, you need to you have to fix some bugs and get it done. Like, we're not doing it for you. That was kind of the philosophy, the ideology of it. Like, you know, when you get your first computer, you have like for example, Apple will give you a very nice wallpaper and like some cool icons. In Sugar Labs, it was just like great, plain, like simple, like go take it and do whatever you want to do it. So it's almost impossible to see someone's Excel computer looking the same as someone else. It's totally impossible. It's either someone has 2 icons, or someone has no icon, or somebody has a lot of icons going on, or there's something wrong somewhere. So it was intentionally designed that way for you to see it as a reflection of your identity, right? And that's kind of how I felt. Until today, like, I've used multiple OSs. I mean, I'm currently doing this call over a Mac. You know, I feel like if I'm not being paid to do my work, I wouldn't even be using it, like, to be fair. But when I was much younger, the intentionality, the design for me, and it made sense because all the kids around me later became an engineer, right? At some point, I was able to interact with people from South America, some part of the US, some part of Europe, some part of India, some part of Africa, and every single person I talked to at some point, I probably doing interesting stuff. Myself, at some point, when I had the opportunity to get a computer, the next OS I installed was Fedora and Kali Linux because I wanted to tinker around, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, that's crazy. It was, but yeah.
In this segment, Samson Goddy talks about how he got in touch with open source at the age of 10 when he started to play with the Sugar desktop environment, and how that influenced his career decisions later. And in that community, was it also a vibrant community in terms of people chatting and working together, or was it more like, here are the bits and pieces, you have access to all of it, and everyone was more just like fixing and hacking on their own?
In the Sugar Labs community, which is the organization that supports the operating system, I would say at some point, because of course I later became a board for Sugar Labs, 90% of the contributors were kids. Kids were going online, talking about their problems and fixing the problems. On code commits were kids. These were kids like myself going in. I remember I got a new version of the Excel computer that one had some touch touch input, like it was kind of a screen touch based laptop. And by default, for some weird reason, something messed up with the locale. So it came in default with Arabic. And I mean, I was still a little bit trying to understand like system level things. I spent like a whole week going through the directory to figure out what file is missing. And then I realized that what the computer was pulling, it was pulling obviously Arabic. There was a string. I just went there, changed it myself to en-gb, and problem fixed, right? Those are kind of the things that you see people doing. Like lots of, I mean, yeah, there were people from OPC that were way older. There were people from MIT that were obviously like 3 to 4 times older. But like, if we're talking about the day-to-day developers, people that you're going to be interacting with on an average, these were kids that were under 15 years old. Yeah, I started using Sugar Labs like when I was like 11 or 10. And I was even one of the oldest kids. There were people beyond that, like 6, 5.
Wow.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was kind of a Google but for kids.
I love it.
Yeah.
In this segment, Clare Dillon talks about why it is crucial for students to get in touch with open source during their studies and how universities are making that happen. Claire, you mentioned that you're currently working more in the public sector and OSPOs and universities and academia. And we've been having conversations with people from both the academic institutions as well as students, and just looking into the impact of open source in academia and vice versa. And I wanted to ask you, like, what your experience and perception is in that space, like that the impact of open source and how much the current movement of more and more universities having OSPOs is helping with introducing open source into the curriculum. So actually giving students access as well as materials and educations about what open source is, and helping them get involved and get their feet wet before they actually go out into the job market.
Yeah, so very, very interesting. So I am currently involved with an organization called Curious, which is the Community for University and Research Institute OSPOs, or Open Source Program Offices. And it's a group of currently 14 institutions who have got OSPOs in it's a relatively new, I suppose, concept in the public sector, specifically in the academic space. So most of them would be less than 2 years old in terms of the OSPO formation. Of course, open source in university context and academic context has been around for a long time, and some of the biggest projects out there, I suppose, are in that's from the academic community. But sometimes I think it's helpful when organizations think about putting a service in that is almost like a central center of excellence, or a focal point for getting something done in a university, because that not only helps, again, kind of learn what the best practices are that are happening in that university, but also helps people know where to go if they need help. And that can be a really beneficial thing. And that's one of the reasons why I think the trend of creating an OSPO has been created. I think sometimes it's also related to the whole open research or open science movement, because as part of that, you have open access, open data, open source software becomes a critical part of making sure that research is reproducible and replicable. And so oftentimes open source program offices are being created in that context. So I will say that in a lot of the OSPOs that I would deal with, working with researchers is definitely one of the reasons why they have come about, because thinking about things like knowledge transfer and thinking about things like impact, valorization of research, how you get social impact, economic impact, spin outs, all of that sort of thing, industry collaborations, how you enable that, and sometimes that requires support. But another factor that they often are dealing with is that educational thing. So looking at undergraduates, what skills do they have? How do they participate in the open source community? How, internship programs that might relate to open source projects, all of that sort of thing. So it's definitely something that is being worked on by many of the OSPOs as well. But also I would say that there's lots of great resources already out there from other organizations. So there's loads of folks who have been working hard to create open source curricula. And sometimes the OSPOs are just about trying to curate what's already there and kind of say, oh, here's something great. How do we get that implemented within our organization as well? So it's a really interesting trend, the creation and the standing up of open source program offices. Sometimes they're not called that. So sometimes those kinds of goals, like enabling research, enabling education in open source community, sometimes even helping internal staff operations around open source in a university, that can often be part of what folks are doing. But all of those things, I think it's wonderful to start seeing centers of excellence coalesce around that. And there are many, I suppose, institutions out there that might even be doing that, just not calling it an OSPO. So, sometimes it's just even about identifying the person that always had that information, was off, doing education on license choices and all this sort of thing, but just that function was never recognized as a separate role. So it's a really interesting trend, and I hope that it will allow for us that when we do figure out the ways that are the best ways to both enable researchers and enable undergraduates in terms of education around this, that we spread it more quickly through the ecosystem then, so folks can learn from each other more quickly.
In this segment, Federico Gonzalez Waite talks about how the Mexican government's decision of embracing open source in policies impacted the country as well as the Latin America region. So with the policies and this whole movement in the government around open source, has that had an impact in the region overall, like private companies, education, like academia?
Academia, yes, because they're now starting to realize that cloud computing, cybersecurity, all these kind of topics are a must for them. So a lot of the in Mexico, we have different levels of education or institutions. So we have like the state universities, and then we have some like technical schools and technical universities that they all belong to kind of like the federal government umbrella. So a lot of them are starting to like take on now open source development and incorporating these ideas into their academic programs. Also, like for example, Infotech, what we also did in our masters and all our educational programs, we also started incorporating ethics into the topic of software development and technology, because I think that's also another important change that we need to start having as a worldwide technological transition that we're having. Making sure that the technology we're developing is not going to be harmful for someone or something. So that's something that has been happening. I think the academic world has latched onto this. When it comes to companies, there was a very big change because a lot of the companies that were developing software for the government, a lot of them actually stopped doing what they were doing and they transitioned into some other things because Infotech was developing or the government was developing a lot of its own technology. So that was kind of like a very big impact as well. And we have had a lot of countries from Latin America asking us about what we're doing. You know, through the time that I was in Infotech, we had a lot of conversations with a lot of countries, and they were very interested about how a government could actually start building these capacities and migrating platforms and like creating their own clouds and creating their own infrastructures and building their own data centers. And that has been like, I am aware of like 2-3 projects of countries that we spoke to that they're actually implementing something similar to what we had done. Of course, like it's interesting to see how they're going to follow up on and how they're going to start making these technological decisions. But yeah, like Mexico has always been kind of like an important player in Latin America, because even like with singers or like soap operas, all these kind of things, they're launched in Mexico and then they start growing in the rest of Latam, you know. So hopefully like that can be replicated to what we're doing with open source. Like also like I was able to be in Indianapolis a couple of months ago now. It's not that long ago for the Open Infra conference, and there were a couple of Spanish speakers there, so we were able to have a good chat. And that was kind of like our big debate, like how can we keep on pushing this agenda and this topic in the region, and actually creating this awareness through other private sector and public sector institutions. And also, like, I think we need to work so much. I think there's a lot of work being done in Latin America, but we somehow don't have the proper forums, or we're not that open to sharing what we're actually doing with open source. And I think that's kind of like the big challenge for the region.
Do you see that changing?
I am not sure. I think there was last year there was a very big event in Guadalajara, and it was very interesting to see the people that turned up and spoke at the event, and it was at one of the universities, so it was a lot of interest. I think that as communities, there needs to be more presence here and more events, because then it's also very difficult for people sometimes to travel to the US because of the visa requirements and those kind of things. And like, for example, right now in Mexico, for processing a tourist visa, it takes you 1.5 years to get an appointment at the US Embassy. So for somebody that wants to go to an open conference in the US, well, you probably need to be planning to go to it in 2027 or 2028 because you won't get a visa before then. No? So like, I think there needs to be a little bit more work done here. Why it has been done, I'm not sure. Like, I'm not sure if like precisely like this openness to actually sharing and talking about it, if that's one of the issues. But it's interesting. Like, I do think this, and like I mentioned before, like there's some great talent here. So how we connect that right talent to the right methods and get them to share and talk about it, and it's about one of those equations of getting the right people in the right place in the right time and doing an incredible event that could probably boost other ones. And we were actually talking about maybe doing like some Spanish tracks as well in some of these open source events. I think that could also maybe be interesting for those that don't speak English that well. And that's something that I also like grasped when I was working here in Infotech. Most of my like key tech people, they were not fluent in English. So that always made them really concerned about participating in anything because they were just concerned that they were not going to understand. So we need to think about those kind of things and see how we can shape them into it and bridge in those gaps.
In this segment, Clare Dillon talks about change management and how it relates to introducing inner source within a company or organization. She also shares tips and tricks on how to manage them. You mentioned agile transformation as a side comment earlier, and I wanted to get back to that from the perspective of cultural change and going through a transformation, because when we think about strict proprietary processes and either inner source or open source, that's a different setup and way of working together. And at least I personally do have the experience of agile quote unquote transformation within a company where we were practically building a newish organization, and we were told by the time I got there that it's going to be agile, whatever that is. And when it comes to external communications, we were doing agile. Now, if you were internally involved, what that meant in practice was think about the waterfall development method and just relabel everything with agile terms. And that's what they were actually doing. And it was very, very painful. In my experience, like this little bit of lying to ourselves was way more harmful than actually doing something that people did not have the experience with yet. So this kind of pretending to do one thing while we are still doing the other thing under the hood, that was just the worst thing that can happen. However, transition periods are usually hard. So I wanted to ask what your experience is in terms of that transformation period where maybe not everybody's bought into the concept. Like, is it management who may not be, or have you seen like developers, engineers struggling with taking on the new concept? So what was your experience with that?
Yes, now I'm, and as I say this, I'm going to very explicitly say this is just the feedback that I've gathered from the Inner Source Commons community as opposed to kind of personal first-hand experience. So with that anecdotal caveat, I would say I think it's really interesting. The Inner Source movement, I suppose, maybe differs from the Agile movement in some respects. I mean, I don't think anyone in Inner Source Commons would say that, it's all figured out yet, that we know exactly how to do it. And I'm thinking about even our patterns practice in the community, because the patterns practice is so powerful because you have maybe a couple of different ways to do a particular thing or to encourage your organization to do inner source depending on your context. So there's a lot of emphasis in the Inner Source Commons community about this idea of experimentation and this idea that, one of the principles of the community is that we will document a pattern, try to encourage people to share their experiences of using that pattern so that we get this idea of how it operates in context, without making a declarative statement to say, you always need to do this. This is the only way to do it. And this person has to do this all the time, right? And I think that's been a very useful way for the community to not come across the kind of, sometimes if you say there's only one way to do this, and now we're going to have a principal fight about who in the organization is going to do this one task, because the book says this and we're doing this, and now we're going to fight about that. In the Inner Source Commons community, it'd be more along the lines of, this thing needs to be done, how do you do it? Who in your team does it? And there's a little bit of kind of, well, you could do it this way, you've got these sort of people, or you could do it this way, you've got these sort of people. But it's sometimes the task that needs to be done, and the cultural differences from organization to organization, even from team to team within organizations, can be very different. Now, of course, it's very beneficial to have a consistent way of approaching things. But what I will say is that, sometimes it's a balance. Sometimes if you come in too hard with, we have to decide the one way we're going to do this, and this means everyone has to change, except that one person who we picked as the example of how to do it, that can be very difficult for people. And sometimes, therefore, I think from a cultural perspective and in order to ensure the best possible success, it can sometimes be more beneficial to pick a pilot project, try it out, observe about whether that will scale, what would be the blockers to scale, are these activities that we're doing in this pilot project scalable across the organization? So everyone in Inner Source Commons would definitely, I think, recommend that idea of gradually scaling a practice rather than coming in one day, like figuring it all out beforehand and coming in with a, day zero, we're all doing it this way, and now your role is this, and your name is this, and all of that sort of thing is possibly, I think, what people have attempted with agile transformations. It's kind of like, and then we bring in a whole lot of consultants, by the way, to tell us what we're doing wrong and how they're going to fix it for us. But that's not what's happening, I think, in terms of Inner Source practices. They are more evolutionary. There's emphasis on sharing feedback about what's working, what's not working, and accepting that may not always be perfect. And I think that's healthy. For me, that helps people come on the journey and be part of deciding what is the best practice for your organization, as opposed to having someone come in and tell you this is the way it is. And that cultural difference of being involved in the change process, I think, can be very, very helpful.
So kind of we could say that based on what you saw in Inner Source Commons, there are goals in terms of where an organization would want to get with things like openness, being able to share a work item, achieving collaboration outside of a team or an organization, and becoming more like company-wide. So you can set up goals, but how you get to achieving those goals, Inner Source and open source can be more flexible and sometimes, I assume, forgiving as well, compared to things like the more rigid processes. So we can say to focus on goals and kind of figuring out what kind of culture you would like to have within an organization. I did see developers struggle with the whole open source concept because it's just, for them, it's something that has been too hard to digest in terms of they had the proprietary workflows and ways of working, and all of a sudden they have to do things in public. They want to retain control, then letting go of that or just opening up the boundaries is just not trivial. So kind of sometimes it feels like that if you had an actual system that you could tell them that this is exactly what you do, then maybe it would be easier to get them to get there. But at the same time, it sounds like that we need to focus on kind of end results and then figuring out what's the best way to get there.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think there's enough emphasis put on that kind of psychological reaction to change that you've just described there, like people wanting control. People, I mean, there's a psychological framework I've sometimes presented on, which I learned when I did a coaching diploma, and I learned it. I remember reading about it. It was David Rock's SCARF model, and it talks about the triggers we have about what generates fear in people, the social circumstances that generate fear, and things like status and certainty and autonomy and relatedness and ideas of fairness. If you threaten any of those, people literally will react emotionally, like, fight, flight, or fight kind of response. And I remember reading that and learning about it and thinking, that is pretty much every change situation I've ever initiated. Like, no wonder people were like acting weird. It's not a rational decision at some point. It's like you're threatening what people know, how they've always worked, what they perceive to be their expertise. You're telling them someone else's can actually impact the code that they feel it's their baby. It triggers all sorts of things. And so I think people have to be very careful about that, first of all. And then, as you say, like, the worst thing to do is to kind of go, this is just the way it is now, because this thing here says so, and this is your new role. Like, that's a death knell to any kind of change program. If it's not going to be explicitly reacted against, it's going to be subverted in some way, because people just don't like that sort of stuff. Now, I will say, I mean, in the inner source, we do have roles defined and things like that. I just think that there's, as you say, there's space for people to experiment with different ways of implementing it. And I personally think, to make change sticky, you need people to like the journey. Because if it's too painful, they'll just give up. And who wouldn't, to be fair.
In this segment, Clare Dillon talks about how people stop being rational when it comes to changes and how you can use the SCARF model to help them. It's interesting sometimes, though, because you see the struggle and you also see that most of the struggle is because people are holding on to something that's not accurate anymore and not doing the change process almost at all. So they're creating double work for themselves. They're overloading themselves with things that they shouldn't be, like having an internal meeting and then sort of sharing the outcomes and summaries and overviews of the internal meeting with the community. And if the topic that they discussed was not strictly proprietary, there were no trade company secrets in it, it could have and should have been an open conversation to start with, which eliminates the need to summarize and then also synchronize back the feedback into your still existing strict internal process. It's just a lot of extra work that burns people out. And sometimes it's just interesting to witness this, because at one point you just run out of ways to try to incentivize people and just, turn on the light that what you're doing is the worst thing that you can do, not to the community, but to yourself. I've seen that happening a little bit, and it's just a head scratcher still, because whatever you say, people demand guarantees. Like, you guarantee if I do it this way, then this is what's going to happen, then the community will be this and that. Like, I can't guarantee. Like, there's no explicit guarantee. I can still guarantee them that if they keep doing it this way, nothing good is going to come out of that. But that's never enough. So that's a very interesting social challenge, and I was interested if it's a similar challenge in Inner Source too, even with a still somewhat closed environment that I assume still feels safer, at least.
Absolutely is, but and I think it really is back to, I mean, I'll reference the SCARF model again, but I find it so powerful because, like, even as you're discussing that, people will tell you this is why they're not doing it. Rationally, I'm not doing it because of this, because I have all these reasons. But oftentimes there is a psychological fear that's going behind that. If you dig a little deeper, you can kind of go, maybe they're feeling this. But the nice thing about the SCARF model is that, in the same way as it can trigger the negative reaction to change, if you kind of pump up those factors, if you incentivize people by helping them gain status through contributions or certainty or autonomy, or if you show them that it increases their autonomy, if it shows them the relatedness, like how they build connections in the external community, how it builds their own personal reputation, if you talk about how they can bring fairness into, how governance is done well in this particular project, so that there is fairness about, you're not going to be left holding the baby if something goes wrong, and no one's going to be ringing you at 2 a.m. or whatever it is that your fear is that you're not articulating. Maybe you're not articulating. If you can pump up those positive aspects as well, those SCARF concepts, it can help deal with that personal motivation. And I think there's loads of things in both the inner source and the open source community that do that. But sometimes I think we're too quick to address the rational argument that people make, thinking that's the actual problem. And oftentimes it's not, because as you say, it's pretty obviously not. Like, they just don't understand that. Like, it's pretty, like, if anyone actually examines the evidence, yes, doing the thing that's less effort in the short term, but more pain in the long term is the wrong thing to do. But we know as people, we do that all the time. Like, I'm not going to the gym, not because I don't know it's the right thing to do, but it's really getting behind that. I think that we all have to think about and stop trying to pretend this is all rational. We are not rational beings. I'm sorry. So we like to think we are, but we're not. So let's deal with that and get to what actually motivates us, because there's plenty of that in open source and inner source. And the more we emphasize those aspects, the more people will get on board and deal with their fears and move towards that positive place of change. But it's not through rational arguments, I think. And this is again the problem with this value conversation. I mean, half the time, you think once you get a bigger bottom value number that everyone's going to go, yay, well, now that makes sense. But it wouldn't solve the problem, just because we think that's the problem because we don't have that number. But honestly, even if we had that number, people would be like, oh yeah, but like, this other way that I used to do it, it's also good because, and they'll think of some other model that we haven't worked out yet, So people don't want to change. They don't want to change. We have to help them want to change.
In this segment, Federico Gonzalez Waite talks about his experience within the Mexican government as they were rolling out changes to rely more on open source and build their own tools and solutions.
I mean, it's a lot of change to actually try to facilitate throughout such a large organization. Did you have any formal channels of cultivating those change agents in the various different teams? Or was that just strictly an informal thing? Or because everybody needs the same resources, right? Everybody needs the same information to get the rest of their organizations on board with what that change looks like. And was there any sharing of information or coordination like that? Or what did you do there?
There was a lot of, from the presidential office, there was a lot of coordination between the CTOs. So there was a lot of chats where we would be sharing information. And that pretty much that chat was like full day, like conversations. Somebody found a vulnerability in somewhere, or somebody's talking about this new technology, or somebody's thinking about buying something or implementing something. And there was also like, we started to like with these products that we were making, it was also like, why make 300 platforms when we could make one and use it in 300 places? So once they saw that something worked in one place, it made it easier to implement in a second place. Because it was kind of like that fear of it's not going to work was gone. It's like, okay, works there. Okay, hopefully it will work here again. So like nothing really formal. There was there was kind of like a board of technology that used to happen in regards to cybersecurity, and that was kind of like a formal place to talk about tech development and for the presidential office to give guidelines to all the agencies. And one of the big things that also happened, and that was also done through our agency and that was promoted by us, was that like government officials, like who are actual like permanent appointments, every year they need to do 40 hours of training a year. And this is kind of like one of the requirements. If you fail to do that like 3 years in a row, like they can remove you from the job. And when we started looking at what was on offer, there was nothing in regards to cybersecurity. So we actually developed 2 cybersecurity projects, courses. One that was kind of like focused to middle management, and you didn't have to be an IT person. Like these were for the average public servant. So we did kind of like for the middle management, and then we did for like the lower part of the team. So this kind of like also helped us that now there was a formal way to generate better awareness about cybersecurity. And of course, this then entails lower cyber risks and incidents. But we started also seeing that once people had been through that course, it was a lot easier for them to understand what we were talking about. And by the time I left, I think we had already trained about 8,000 people or something like that. So there was a big, like that would have been running like, there were kind of like set timeframes for the courses every year and kind of like every 6 months. But that had a very big impact. And this was, again, another thing that was launched from all the way until the top. And it was kind of like a way also to make like this knowledge that it's on top and with the CTOs to trickle through the rest of the agency.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave comments under the episodes that you watched. Share your feedback and share your experiences to continue the conversation. And let us know what topics you would like to hear next. We already have a lot of great content lined up for Season 2. We will talk about inner source, or in other words, why and how companies are using open source methodologies internally. We will talk about why and how governments are using open source and touch on upcoming legislations such as the Cyber Resiliency Act in Europe. We will also discuss how to create open source projects and communities that last for decades. Stay tuned because the next episode is just around the corner.
Wouldn't you wish there was a silver budget and bullet, but no, silver budget as well. Silver budget that is
that's
a silver
what you
bullet.
need is a silver. Exactly.
That's it. And to be fair, some people.
So I bought some bidets. This should have been a very simple project. This should be simple. What bidet do you want? You install the bidet and you sit down and you enjoy the bidet. That's it, simple. But I bought the best bidet. And you know how engineers go. Nothing simple.
But we just had a good time just talking and whatnot. And by the end of it, he figured out I played pretty quick. So by the end of it, he actually made me play with him. And so I played music with Kix Brooks. That was fun.
Way cool. That's a great story.
He is waiting for me to finish this podcast so that, I don't know if you